I am Carrie Thomas Cody, and this is Suspend Disbelief, the show where we invite you to open your mind and expand your horizons as we discuss the paranormal, taboo, and otherwise mysterious occurrences in our universe. So today I have two special guests. We have Johnny and Kevin. Both of them are buddies, and they are writers and editors at a tribe called Geek, and I'd love to hear more about that. So go ahead, guys. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Johnny. Start with you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, I'm Johnny J, and I'm the founder of a tribe called Geek, and also a new publication called Grim Native, which is going to focus exclusively on Native horror and a lot of subcultures, especially within modeling and gaming. So I'm really excited about that. I'm from the Oto, Missouri, and Choctaw tribes out of Oklahoma, although I am here in LA right now. And yeah, that's about it about me.
Sweet. Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Kevin Chuculate. I've been writing over there at Tribe Called Geek for a little while. I like writing kind of across the board, a whole lot of things. I've been writing more recently, working on my kind of fiction muscle, developing that a bit with some horror stories and things like that. Recently graduated from OU with my master's in Indigenous Peoples Law.
Holy cow.
And
Congrats
so,
on that.
yeah,
That's a big deal.
yeah, it was pretty great.
Master's
So,
degree. God.
yeah. And then I'm over here just talking about scary stuff. But and I have a pod coming really, really soon this month that's called
Heck yeah.
Nativeverse. And that's going to be talking to different native creatives on their fandoms in both horror and in heroes. So, in
Right
those
on.
kind of two areas, which both of you guys will be on later. So,
Let's go. I'm very excited about this one. Well, sweet. So, again, I'm excited to have you guys on the show. Kevin, I'm buddies with you. I've known you for a little while. Johnny, I haven't really met you yet. So, you're out in LA. What are you doing out there?
Well, not a whole lot. I'm immunocompromised, so I stay indoors quite a bit. I'm like Sasquatch. If you see me out in the wild, it's a big deal. And I just got back from
Yeah.
Denver. Actually, I was down at IACON, which is just one of several Indigenous Comic Cons that are popping up, which is really cool. But I was there to present on Native horror and also to do my Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse Freestyle workshop.
So, what was the workshop like? What did you guys do exactly? Just like cosplay type stuff or build weapons or
Oh
what?
yeah, it's a whole thing. So like there was a lot of cosplay, there was a lot of like artists, I mean it was just discussing like native fandoms, like how to get into writing, just a bunch of different panels. And then like with Indigenous horror, it's a growing genre right now. And a lot of people always wonder why it took so long for there to be Indigenous horror, and there always has been Indigenous horror. The problem is it's not always recognized as horror because it's so different from mainstream horror in a lot of senses, in that it kind of borders within dark fiction. So, a lot of it is based in addressing historical trauma, colonization. And so when non-natives see Indigenous horror, they don't always get they don't always get the horror of it and they're kind of confused by it. And so, I love being able to go to these different cons and to have that platform to really discuss and to celebrate and give shine to like a lot of our horror creatives, because the work that they're doing is just so fantastic. And it also kind of takes away some of the stigma too, because I don't know if it's the same for a lot of people, but growing up, if you were into comic books or if you were into like goth culture or heavy metal, you were kind of pushed to the fringe as a native a little bit. Like it's okay to be a scholar or an athlete, but anything that kind of strays away from that and is too far from being native, kind of pushes you on the outskirts. And so you're kind of like ostracized a little bit, don't really fit in or know where you fit in within your community. Um, so I like being able to have those conversations and let people know that, hey, it's cool to be into comic books. It's okay to be a horror fan. It's okay to be goth. It's okay to be in heavy metal. None of that lessens your indigeneity. If nothing, it just enriches that experience.
Love it. Very well said. Uh, yeah, I mean, I particularly feel like the natives in my area, my cousins and friends. I grew up in a small town, Tecumseh, Oklahoma, that was about 40% Native American population in our school. And so it was pretty rich as far as native culture goes. Lots of different tribes um, populate themselves in that area. And so it basically seemed like all the natives were pretty into horror. And so it was always something we could talk to. I remember talking to my buddy Cheyenne Deathridge in second grade. It was 1999. He was telling me about this scary movie he watched with his dad called the Blair Witch Project. And I was like, what? I have to see this movie. And so I talked to my dad and we rented it. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It scarred the crap out of me. But it was just something very regular that we talk about is these scary movies that we'd watch. And even as early as second grade, having, night terrors that this invisible witch was coming to get me, you know. I remember having this particular night where we had bunk beds, and God, I fell asleep on the top bunk and woke up on the ground. I must have fallen off or climbed down or something, and I somehow like crawled underneath the bottom bunk, and so I was hiding under the bed, not knowing how I got there. I just remember waking up and be like, "How did I get down here?" I fell asleep on the top bunk, but it was like right around that time that I watched Blair Witch Project, and I just remember being so scared. Like I woke up so scared, and I didn't know why. I don't know. It was very scary. And of course, having night terrors of Michael Myers chasing me around my house and stuff like that was pretty regular growing up. So, but yeah, dude, that's really cool that you're doing that. You're out there doing the thing.
Yeah, and it's the same. I grew up in with horror from like when I was super little, and my grandparents were the ones who actually introduced me to horror. And I hate to really date myself, but it was like the 50s and 60s creature features. So like I grew up on
Nice.
Night of the Lepus, Tarantula, ants, and just and then it kind of
Heck yeah.
went from there to the Alfred Hitchcock show, Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and I still cannot listen to the theme from Tales from the Dark Side without just getting like super creeped out. But like I mean, I grew up on horror, and I actually grew up in Oklahoma as well, in Red Rock, Oklahoma, in Ponca City, and kind of funny story. So I was into horror as a young age, writing scary stories and stuff. But I remember an instance where I wrote a scary story for class, and we were supposed to present them. And I had rigged this necklace that I had. It was already frayed, so I was like, "All right, cool. If I just pull it here, it'll break." So I wrote this story about a haunted necklace. And at that key moment in my story, as I'm sharing with the class, I break the necklace, just like the ghost in the story broke the necklace.
Yo.
And it freaked everybody out to the extreme, to the point where apparently after school, parents were calling the principal and complaining about this story that their kids were scared. And so the next day, they actually pulled me into the principal's office, and I was in fourth grade, mind you. But they pulled me into the principal's office, and they called my mom, and my mom showed up, and they were like, we're really concerned about her stories. They're very dark, and I'm like, wait, what? Like, what's going on? And some of the kids were complaining about, scared of ghosts, breaking necklaces, and scared to go back to class. And they were giving my mom this whole spiel about like, oh, you might want to have her talk with a therapist, and if she can't tell fact from fiction. And I'm like, wait a second, like I know fact from fiction. Um, wouldn't you
Yeah,
could be
you're like,
more
let
concerned
me
about
let
these
me
other
tell you.
kids?
Like this was just a story. I'm just
Yeah, and
telling a
it's just a
story.
story. And like
Yeah.
I even explained like how I broke the necklace and everything. And it got so bad that my mom was just like, okay, this is ridiculous. You know what? We're gonna pull her from the school. And they sent me to Ponca City for
What?
school because it was
Yeah.
just like so polarizing, because like for even when I went back to
From
class and
a
stuff,
story. Uh-huh.
yeah, over a story. But I was called Bloody Mary. That's how the kids started referring to
What?
me, was as Bloody Mary. And it was crazy because moved, I went to Ponca City schools, and I went back to the school for seventh grade. And when I got there, what were they still calling me? Bloody Mary. And it
She's like,
continued until
she's
I was
back.
a junior in high school. It was so hilarious just because it stuck and that story stuck. And I'm sitting there like, fourth grade me was kind of a badass.
Yeah, that's a compliment. Absolutely. You got pulled out of school because of a story you told
Of
that
a
you scared a bunch of your
story.
classmates. That is
Yeah, and it got me
amazing.
banned from horror for years. My mom absolutely banned
Oh
me from anything
my
horror,
gosh.
which is
Oh,
another
that
hilarious
sucks.
story because the way I got around that was with Freddy's Nightmares, which was like the TV
Okay.
series based on Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yep.
So because it was a syndicated show, it was up to the networks that picked it up to decide what time to air the show. So in
Hmm.
Oklahoma, it would air about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's when I would
After
get to
school.
watch my horror shows because my parents weren't
Yep.
home from work at the time. So it was my little
Yeah.
loophole.
That's amazing. Evan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, mine kind of was almost, it's like similar in some areas, but very different. I mean, I've told a lot of people this story, but like my kind of horror superhero origin story thing was I was 5 years old and my parents had me watch Halloween, which is my favorite movie just ever, 19, the original. And so I watched it when I was five, and I to this day still remember the nightmare I had that night. We lived in these apartments, and I went to stay the night with my friend Tyler. And I woke up in the middle of the night because I had a nightmare that there were witches surrounding me at my apartments with butcher's knives. And I was just in a circle, and they were all there. And so I woke up in the middle of the night, was scared, so I just left their house and went to my house and went back to bed. And so that's literally that was my first horror movie. And the funny thing is like I would say I only have about probably a handful, maybe about five movies that have really scared me, like actually produced fear for me. Because I was almost like I think kind of desensitized to it when growing up. Like I just watched. My parents were a little bit probably too fluid with that. We even still to this day, we are here. My mom stays with us here, and so we even still continue in October. I started this from when I was a little kid. We watched a horror movie every day in October, and so every evening we'd watch horror movies, and that went until I left for school and everything. Growing up here in Oklahoma, but and I had very similar too. I remember one time I used to draw and doodle a lot, and one of the things I wasn't a good artist, still not. Wish I could, but one of the things that is really easy to draw is a butcher's knife because it's just like a little rectangle and then a line and then a little thing. And so you could draw a person just holding one. And I remember when I was younger having pages and pages of little monsters and little people with masks. And then there was one page, and I think my dad happened to get my notebook one time. And so I was doing something else, and my dad had my notebook, and there was a page of this monster with a knife, and I even put like a little squiggly line and then colored it with a red pencil with the blood, and the person's on the ground with two little X's over their eyes, which if you see movies, usually that's the weird sign. But I wasn't the quiet kid doing it. I was the like talking all the time, joking kid. And so I remember my dad even coming and telling me like, "Hey, is this something I should be worried about?" And I was like, "No, this just looked cool. I just thought it looked cool. And kind of similarly, when I wrote short stories at school, I used to love putting stories together. My mind naturally just does that. Like literally, when Johnny was telling hers, my first thought went to, what if there was a story of a young girl, Bloody Johnny, who was picked on for her interests, and then she left for a couple of years and came back, and she was different. They thought she was the same girl, but they had bullied her so bad one time, and they didn't realize it switched, and now she's back. My mind just kind of goes like that, and even since a young age, it's always been doing that. But I've always like kind of been interested in that, and then family stories. Growing up, I didn't mention yet, but I'm Cherokee Nation here in Oklahoma, really close right here to Tahlequah. We're kind of aiming to move right there where our capital is, and we have different versions of stories that we have. I have the stories that my mom tells me. I have the story that she tells me that her grandma told her. My older sister, she lives in Arizona now. She's kind of the seen a bunch of super wild stuff a person in our family. She's the one that has that kind of for her she says curse, others might say gift. I mean, she's been pretty good. But like she's had that kind of like consistent all the time experience. And so even with our friends, she would tell us stories, and she was a few years older than me, and she would sit us down and we'd be out there. Whereas she just tells a story. Some of them mixed with traditional things, some of them just kind of a general, just trying to scare us because I'm her little brother. And but like we would hear so many different ones. I mean, we have the stories that the little people had always heard about, that just like not as much of a horror story, but just my family also has ADHD, so we really probably wasn't the little people. It was just us losing our stuff, you know. And so,
It's
but
always a good excuse to have something
oh
to blame
yeah,
on, you know.
yeah. But that's always been kind of the things that I've loved to read. I mean, obviously, I mean, I don't know what person, if your parents allowed you, didn't have those Goosebumps books or the Goosebumps Choose Your Adventures or the things like that. I loved all that stuff, and just, and thankfully, whenever I did meet someone that I'm a partner with now, whereas she was kind of a bit more, her parents didn't let her. That's now her favorite thing in the world. We even went to Salem on Halloween about 2 or 3 years ago, and which was really fun and awesome and weird. It was just one of the coolest trips. So yeah.
That's amazing. Speaking of reading fiction, horror fiction as a kid, yeah, Goosebumps was pivotal to me as a kid getting into horror. Lots of middle grade horror that I picked up in elementary school that really just kind of like piqued my interest in horror. And I had already seen some scary movies at the time. We weren't necessarily allowed to watch them, but you know, my parents weren't always there to stop us from turning on the TV and watching something spooky, you know, or just catching something midway through and not knowing what it is, but sitting down and be like, what is this? I'm just going to watch the rest of it. And then having no idea what it was called. You know, that was just something that regularly happened in our household. But speaking of reading horror fiction, Johnny, you're wearing that cool Jade Daniels shirt. Let's talk a little bit
Yes.
about Stephen Graham Jones real quick.
I cannot say enough.
So, oh,
I am such a
yeah,
fangirl. So right before I left for Denver, he tweeted out that he had signed some books at one of the bookstores in the airport. And so as soon as I got there to
love it.
Denver, my first thing was going to search for the books. And I didn't find them there when I arrived, but when I was coming back to
Dang,
LA, I was in the terminal, I found the books, and I was like, yes. But
that is
you know,
amazing.
I really gravitated towards, my heart is a chainsaw. Um,
Mhm.
and I can fangirl about this series like till the cows come home, because for me, I think Jay Daniels is literally the most important native literary figure that we have, just
Mhm.
because so much of our native literature is, the characters are traumatized in some way from colonization, dealing with the impact of that, whether it impacts your family, your community, all of these different things. But
It
for Jay
impacts all of
Daniels
us.
and the
It's impacted everything, you know.
everything. And
So yeah,
so
we
the
all
thing
cope
that
in different ways.
exactly. And that's what I loved about Jay Daniels, because for her, it was through horror. And,
Hmm.
and Stephen Graham Jones, he's really good about writing these stories where, yes, the characters may be native, but their entire
Hmm.
identity and the way that they operate doesn't hinge on the fact that they're native. So, like, at the end of the day, it's her intelligence that is coming to the rescue, and not necessarily some mystical native magic that she's pulling from. So she gets to be
True.
human, she
Yeah.
gets to be her, and she's an absolutely flawed character, and she's been through a lot to the point where she doesn't think that she deserves to survive, and she isn't doesn't deserve to be the final girl. And there's even a line, like the whole section in the book, My Heart is a Chainsaw, is towards the very end, when she realizes, like, the girl that she thought was the final girl isn't the final girl, and that there's nobody else
Hmm.
that can fill that role but her. And she kind of steps into
Chills.
that power, and it is such
Hmm.
a pivotal moment. Like, it just stuck with me, because it's like, I think as natives, especially as native youth, we're always going through different things. We all have different circumstances, and sometimes those circumstances are really bad. Sometimes we're dealing with alcoholism, whether it's our parents or ourselves, drug abuse, we're going through dealing with mental health issues, dealing with suicide, all of these different things. And so it's really hard, not to internalize that at times, and make it feel like for some reason maybe we deserve to not have good things, or don't deserve to survive, or whatever. So I think the way that he wrote this book to the point where she came to that realization that just everything that she'd gone through in her life, it was okay. Like it didn't make her less worthy of survival than anything else, but it did give her some strength and tools to use to be able to save everybody. And so, I really love the whole My Heart is a Chainsaw trilogy because it's just a beautiful story. And like I'm sad. I still have one chapter left in the last book that I just can't bring myself to read yet
You
because I
have to
don't want
read
it
it.
to end.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I get that. I get that. Absolutely, you got to read it. It's touching. You got to close that chapter at your own pace when you can, of course. But man, oh, it's so good. And so for my listeners who aren't much readers, uh, yeah. So Stephen Graham Jones is what tribe is he? Is he Blackfoot? I forget.
That's a good
He's a
question.
he's a native writer from Texas. Grew up just in West Texas, very white rural area. Didn't grow up around natives, and so he didn't necessarily grow up in this res type setting, but he still has a lot of he's still got a lot of culture within him through his his bloodline and his people and stuff. And so as an adult he went out and kind of experienced the world a little bit. He's a writer. He's published a couple dozen books. But and for me, like I'm I would say I'm a big reader, but I didn't even hear about him until about 5 years ago when The Only Good Indians came out. And I'm like, oh shoot, it's like a Dear Woman type story. I should check it out. And I read it and I was like, this is actually really good. I wonder who this guy is. I didn't know that he had a bunch of books before that. And so that kind of kept my eyes on him a little bit, and then I heard about My Heart is a Chainsaw, and I'll be honest, like his writing is it's challenging to kind of stick with, and so I catch myself kind of going back through chapters and be like, what did I miss again? And so it's just his stream of consciousness, his writing style that is kind of hard to follow for me at times and for other people that I've talked to, but like once you see the whole picture, it's brilliant, it's beautiful. And the Indian Lake trilogy is exactly that. As a full story, it's beautiful. Every book in itself is a great adventure and just a fun story,
Yeah,
and
and I
lots
think
of
that's the
good
thing that
kills.
also makes him so prolific is the fact that he's really been able to transcend. So when people talk about Stephen Graham Jones, he's not just a native horror creative. He's not just a native horror writer or just a native writer. Like his work is prolific through the horror community because there's so many. Like I keep finding new and newer books. So October 1st was actually Stephen Graham Jones Day, and they released a
Nice.
lot of his works that are no longer in publication. So it was kind of like a mad dash trying to get different books that you wouldn't have access to normally because there's just so many and he's constantly writing. And through the native community, we only really typically hear about the native books. Like My Heart is a
Mm-hmm.
Chainsaw, The Only Good Indian, Mapping the Interior. We and mongrels even, we hear about those
Mm-hmm.
books in Indian country because they're native about native people. But he has so many other works that are just so more universal, I guess you would say. And it's really cool to see that he's been embraced as a horror writer and recognized as a horror writer who just happens to be native and not really stuck in that typecast of being a native writer only. And like and I found Stephen Graham Jones like a while ago, and it was at the very first Indigenous Comic-Con he was going to be there. And so like I had my copy of Mongrels, which had just come out, for him to sign,
Wow.
and I got so nervous. I walked up to his table, I set my book down, and I forgot what I was there for, and I got so nervous I just walked off.
You're
And
kidding me. Oh my
so
gosh.
embarrassing because like I've read Mongrels and I went down a rabbit hole and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. This is like our Stephen King because he just has so many books. And I mean, he's just an incredible writer, but he's an even better person. And he's very down. So I have a little post. I call him part of my unholy trinity, which is Stephen Graham Jones, Grady Hendrix, and Paul Tremblay. Those are like my three favorite horror writers at the moment. And I actually put a picture up of the three of them as the unholy trinity from Glee. I just replaced the cheerleaders' heads, which would be Quinn, Santana, and I can't remember the blonde girl's name, but like I just transposed their heads on the cheerleaders because I was like, there's my unholy trinity. But like, he loved the picture, and but I mean, he's when you're on Twitter, like I see him having conversations with people. Like he's such a down to earth person, and just really cool the way that he engages with readers and people that are involved, like just around his fandom in general. And it's such a cool thing to see somebody be that open.
I'm a big fan of this podcast called The King's Cast, and it's just Stephen King podcast. And Stephen Graham Jones is basically a regular at this point. He's been on like 10 episodes, and just hearing him just talk, his stream of consciousness, his stories about his childhood, um, they're insane. He had, it probably still has an incredibly interesting life, and this guy has stories and stories for days. It's incredible, and I just love hearing him talk and knowing, like, reading, say, My Heart is a Chainsaw, or now I'm reading I Was a Teenage Slasher, and just like hearing it in his voice, I'm like, oh, this is like completely understand how he could write all of this the way that he does, because he just had such an interesting life. Big fan of Stephen Graham Jones, and it was interesting that you said that he kind of broke through from being like typecast as like a native writer. And I see that a lot with other writers. Like he's just included in the conversation of being like one of the great horror writers at the moment. And I think it's just so cool that he's not just like, oh, well, because he's Native American. Like, no, he's an incredible story writer, and his characters sometimes, they're mentioned that they're native. He has mentioned on King's Cast that all of his main characters are native. He may not say it, but since he's native, like they are too. And I just think that's so interesting, because I have always never, like, I'm sure we've all kind of experienced this, where we've kind of felt like we didn't belong in the native community because we didn't feel tradition enough, or didn't feel like we were native enough because we didn't grow up on the same res as these other people or whatever. And there was been a lot of my life where I was just like, I don't know if I want to, call myself like Native American, or label myself as that, because I don't feel like I am enough, even though I am in my own way, and my family does things differently, and we still have heard all these stories and stuff growing up. But my journey and my path is different than everybody else's, and it doesn't make me any less native than anybody else. And also, like, I don't feel like I don't know how you guys feel about people using the like using Native American to try to, like, get a leg up in life, or I feel like there's a name for it now, where
One that I've heard is Opportunian.
oh, that's
There's
what it
another
was.
person. Okay, there's one particular guy I know. He's Cherokee. He's Eastern Band, and he
Hmm.
makes a lot of cartoon art and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And he kind of, I know he had used that. Well, he was talking about a specific situation too. He wasn't
Okay.
trying to necessarily apply it, because sometimes some of those things
Hmm.
can apply to a group, and
Yeah.
unfortunately it hits like a shotgun. It hits like a lot of other people that it doesn't mean to, and it can cause some people to feel that kind of angst that you're even describing,
Exactly. Like, I don't want to be
because these,
put into that
yeah.
box, so
Yeah, well, it
sometimes I'm
taps
afraid
into
to,
your
like.
insecurities, right? Like, I think we
Hmm.
all have insecurities. Like, because I grew up within my community. Um, I was even a princess. I grew up very
Love it.
traditional too. So, um, but I always felt like on the fringe because of my interest in like horror and stuff. And so, like, what you're talking about, like, I totally understand that because I think, like, right now, we're finally getting some visibility, and
Hmm.
it's such a good thing, but at the same time, like we've been invisible for so long that we don't necessarily know how to handle that visibility, or to how to go about promoting like the work that we do necessarily without falling into like those tropes of being like, okay, how do we know the difference between like native representation and exploitation? Like,
Yeah.
how do we know that we're, actually raising awareness about an issue, or we're commodifying it? And there's a lot of like different nuances that I don't think we've necessarily, like, we're still just trying to figure it out. Because now we got the platforms, like we have I mean, just so many different ways to get our narratives out there. It used to be through literature and art alone, and now there's just this whole typecast idea that native art and native literature, it has to be a certain way. But now we're coming to this point where it's evolving so quickly, like, with especially with art. A lot of our art is based in pop culture because we contribute to pop culture. When you look at the Star Wars franchise, for example, there's a lot of native influence from the way that Princess Leia wore her space buns, to a lot of the languages that are based on indigenous languages. The Ewoks, which I find is so hilarious, was kind of a
I was gonna
nod
say
to
the
the Miwok
Ewoks.
people here in
Wow.
California. And so, like there's little things that we find in pop culture, and as natives, like we're part of that. Like we are Star Wars fans, we're Whovians, we're Potterheads, and just, we're all part of that. And you see that being reflected in through our art, through our literature, even Stephen Graham Jones with My Heart is a Chainsaw. He's talking about Jay Daniels, and she's a horror fan. So she loves Nightmare on Elm Street, Michael Myers, like, and all of that knowledge is there. And that speaks to so many natives because that's like how we grew up. Like me, I actually have a little shrine next to my bed. So I'm a huge Michael Myers fan, and next to my bed I have a picture of a little, like a drawing that's a photograph of him and Jason being buddies. And I also have, of course, some little Michael Myers Funkos, a little snow globe. Um, I mean, it's just my thing. I have all the books. I let me show you my phone. I don't know if you could see that really well, but I have Michael Myers on my phone, on my computer. But I mean, that's just, I love horror. That's, where I find a lot of the
I
joy.
have the little tattoo of whenever he puts the little ghost thing on in the glasses in the first movie, because I think it's so stupid and funny and amazing that I was like, oh, I want to get
I
a Myers
created a
tattoo and I want to get
meme
that specific
too.
moment.
Yeah, I created a meme and I was like, why you never see Michael Myers on the res? And natives, we have blankets for doors. And so I have him with like one of the little native blankets on with the little glass, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's funny. I don't
that
think I've
is
seen that one.
funny.
That one's
I haven't seen
hilarious.
that one either. And
I'll
Kevin,
have to
dude, I'm
pull that
so
one
jealous
up.
of that tattoo.
I love
I
it.
didn't know
Like,
you had that tattoo. I'm so jealous. I
yeah,
would have never thought
I
of that.
just
That's great.
I actually just got it on my birthday. My birthday was on Friday the 13th. So, the tattoo
Nice.
shops have all the little deals.
Yeah.
And at the place I went to, they didn't have the pre-made ones. They were like, "Hey, just come up with a design that's a certain size, blah blah blah." And I waited pretty much most of the day, and I got it, and I was super happy. It's funny because I was a little bit different though, Johnny, with how I viewed Jason and others. So even in sports, I grew up a Kobe fan. So when LeBron came around, I was like, LeBron sucks. It's all about Kobe. I don't know who McGrady sucks. All these other players suck. It's Kobe. So when there was Michael Myers and people would talk about Jason, I was like, those movies are boo boo. He looks cool, but he doesn't even look cool until a couple movies in. I was like, he goes to space. That's fun. And I did like him a little more, but I was just so like, no, it's Myers. He's the best. He's the best. He put the dude's head exploded. I think I was like 7, and I always remember that scene, which they changed in a director's cut. I learned recently because I downloaded the wrong version and I was watching it and I was like, oh no, that's the worst dude in all the movies. He's such a dickhead guy. And then
Which
Michael
movie was
Myers
that
puts
again?
his, I
I
think it's
forget.
the,
Yeah, that's
I forgot
Revenge of
which one
or
exact.
the Curse of Michael Myers,
The
right?
Curse of
The
Michael
Curse.
Myers.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
that's right. Yes, and
That's one with
so
the Paul Rudd in it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
Okay,
good
I
one.
know what scene you're talking about, but yeah, I actually
wait.
noticed that because I watched it on streaming a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, wait a second. I was like, something's
Yeah,
not
I was
right
like, there's
here.
no other series I would know that level of detail, but it's always been one of my favorite kills in any movie because it just looked so crazy, and I was such a little kid, and I was just like, oh my god, his head exploded, like, and we were watching it, and I was like waiting for the moment. I was sitting there like, oh, here it comes. This guy's been rude the whole movie. He's about to get his just due, and it just went past it, and I was like, oh my gosh, hold on, everyone, let me at least pull it up on YouTube. Here's what really happened.
No, I'm the same way. So I literally think I went through like a time portal or something because when the 2018 Halloween trilogy came out, I went to a press screening, and then of course I went to the opening night. And so I loved it. Like there were certain things in there because, I for me, I always I find the things that relate to, and for me, it's that story of generational trauma. Like with the original Halloween, you see her being traumatized. With the 2008,
Hmm.
you see how that trauma affected her life, and not just her life, but her kids and her grandkids. And,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I see what they're going with this trilogy. But there was a moment towards the end where her crazy doctor, or Michael's crazy doctor, and the sheriff were riding through town, and he's asking him about the town, and he's like, "Well, what about Michael's house?" And he's like, "Oh, well, it was such a blight on the community that we tore it down and we turned it into something good. We turned it into a community garden." And at the beginning of the movie, when Allison goes out running, you see her run past that community garden, and like she stopped in front of it.
Oh.
And so, like, I was like, "Oh, okay, that's what that was." But then when they came out with Halloween Kills, the story deviated so much that I think they had to go back and edit things out for coherency. So that scene is gone. That quote is gone. And I was like, "I swear it was
I
there.
don't
I
Oh.
remember
know it
that
was
at
there."
all. That is
It's in the
crazy.
book. It's in the novelization still. So I was like, "Okay, I know I'm not crazy. It's
Whoa.
here in the book still."
Yeah.
But it's not in the movies anymore, because with the movies they brought in, they tried to make it
Big John, Little
more,
John.
yeah, and they brought his house back. And I thought it was
Hmm.
such a cool thing of like, okay, where are they going to take this? Because what happens when Michael's house isn't there, when the place that he was drawn to, or his safe place, isn't there, and he's already kind of like bloodthirsty. So what happens when they tear that down? Like, what kind of havoc is going to come from that? And then they just totally did away with that story in Halloween Kills. And I was just like, oh, that's so disappointing, because that would have been such a good leeway to see, okay, now they traumatize somebody who's already out for blood, on top of dealing with, Lori being out for blood too. Like, it would have just made for some really crazy action, but they changed the whole story. But I noticed things like that in, like, Halloween, on all these little inconsistencies, like, wait a second.
Oh yeah.
And it's funny because I can only do that with the Halloween series.
Same. Yeah. Oh, definitely. Like, there's no other thing I think I've watched that much to notice all the little small things. What I'm trying for next year. I'm gonna try to. I don't know if either of you are familiar with Shea Serrano at all. He's a writer. Um, but he's written some books that are kind of paired with illustrations a lot, and they became like insanely popular. And so I'm gonna try here this next October. I'm gonna be having kind of an illustrated essay of the different eras of the Halloween movies, and so I'm gonna have like the first two. I'm gonna lump the third one and then the two Rob Zombie ones together, and then I'm gonna have like the next three together, and then H2O and the one Resurrection together, and then the final like last three, kind of like different eras. Because if this was like the MCU, these are all different. Some of these are different universes. Like she has kids that we never hear about again. There's a daughter. There's all this stuff and we're just like, I guess it never happens again. But I'm probably gonna be chatting y'all up a little bit more to get some more things to write about in there, because like there's just so much that even I miss through that, because I've seen them and then you almost become familiar, but yeah, when something changes you see it right away. That's why I was like, oh no, I know this happened because I remember this memory as a little kid.
Yeah, and it's crazy because with streaming, they can edit films that way now. That's what
Yeah.
boggles my mind, right? Because I'm still trying to find somebody who may have bought Halloween 2018, like back in 2018, to see if their hard copy
Mm.
still has that scene or not. Because, I mean, with streaming, they could just go in and zap things, they can censor certain words or whatever. It's crazy. But like, talking to the different eras, so I highly recommend reading Taking Shape and Taking Shape 2, which is all about the making of the Halloween movies. And so they do like a lot of interviews with some of the writers, um,
Oh, I'm
and
here for
just talk
that.
about how the
That's great.
movies
I've
came to fruition. And
Yeah,
then
I've
Taking
seen
Shape
like
2 is
all the
about all the
videos
missing
from
stuff.
okay, I've seen
Oh.
all the videos from John Carpenter talking about it, and behind the scenes that I could get a hold of on YouTube, and behind the scenes of whatever people uploaded on YouTube. So that's fascinating to me. I'll absolutely check those books out. That's great.
Oh yeah, I'm such a nerd. Like I listen to him and I'm like, oh, I was like, okay, this makes sense because I mean, even before, like I'm such a nerd. Like I was that person that was reading fan scripts. And it's kind of fascinating to see that some of those fan scripts became movies, but they were given to different writers and they kind of, redid them to fit whatever the studio was looking for. And then also to see how certain films ended up the way they did because of what the studio wanted versus what, the
Yeah.
writers and the fans even wanted. So, I mean, those two books, like I've been just fascinated by them.
Heck yeah, that rocks. Well, it's a spooky season, guys. This is the perfect leeway into some scary stories. So, listeners, if this may be your first time listening, this is a Scary Stories podcast. And since me and Oren, we're both native, we have a lot of native stories to tell, and we have a lot of friends that come and tell some great Native American horror stories, scary stories, legends, myths, whatever. And it could range from anything from being like, Stiginies or Deer Woman or Bigfoot to kind of being, like, dolls, haunted dolls or UFOs, anything like that. So I want to open the floor to both of you guys. If you guys have any paranormal experiences, supernatural experiences, or stories that you've heard firsthand from people, I would love to hear them, and my listeners absolutely would love to hear them as well.
Yeah.
So, with your tribe specifically, what are some mythological legends or creatures that are close to you guys?
Well, we definitely
Well,
have
one of the
Deer Woman.
first one, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Deer
Oh,
Woman is big, and she's big in
yeah.
the Kiowa tribe as well. And that was like when I found out that other natives knew who Deer Woman was when I was in like middle school. I'm like, what? But they called her Deer Lady or whatever. So I was like, it's probably not the same, right? But I just remember being blown away. I'm like, do you guys know who Deer Woman is too? That's crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the first ones that I think of that I don't know if it's fully unique because a lot of times some of the stories different people have different versions and ways that
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
combine with other tribes. But one of the first ones that I think there's a woman named Spearfinger, and so Spearfinger is a woman who she's an elderly woman that has the skin of like a statue. Like she looks normal, but her skin is like impenetrable. And she is also a shapeshifter. So I mean, she's like loaded up like Thanos. And then, of course, hence her name, Spearfinger. One of her fingers protrudes out really long, like a
No.
spear. And so with this finger, what happens is it was kind of a story that had been told for kids that had to do with like two like blindly trusting strangers, and what it was the Spearfinger would come in and she would remove livers from the children. And what would happen is not only was she remove them with the spear, but then it would be sewn up or done in a way where you can't even see that it happened, and that it would be closed up already by the time you wake up and everything. And so there's that the whole story, and then there's the story with her because she would carry her heart in a bag that she has with her, and so that's kind of like her one weakness. And then there's the story of the townspeople who tried to get her, but then she kept killing people and doing these things. And but then finally there was a couple of warriors who came to approach her, and one saw that there was the vulnerable spot. And one version says a spear, another says a bow. But then where it finally hits that and defeats her, but kind of again the big moral in a sense is about that kind of way of blindly trusting other people from other areas. And it always I always think of that one too because it reminds me of even just our connection, just specifically for me, Cherokee, but like a lot of us with horror. I mean, half of our stories are pretty scary if you tell them with the right music in the background, and if you have a good imagination. You're like, oh, this person turned into a corn husk doll. So like their flesh was like being stretched and stripped down, and their bones were warping into this thing, and it was there to kind of teach almost like a moral. And so that's one of the ones I think of the most, even to the point where the first kind of comic run I'm going to be writing later, like I have it's set in a town called Spearfinger. I have like these little Easter eggs of just different people kind of being involved with certain parts that I try to put a little bit of our traditional stuff in there, even just for us, where I'm like, hey, I know just Cherokee people might understand this one little part where this lady has a long finger, and they're going to be like, oh, I know why he wrote that, or things like that. But that's one of the first ones I thought. And I can't remember where and who told it one time, but I just remember there was one person who told that story in such a great way where I was like, ugh, like she almost sounds like a villain when if you would just blandly describe her characteristics, but the way that they would talk, that her voice would change to someone else's voice and how she could imitate something else. And then they were still trying all the weapons, but her skin was hard also and impenetrable. I was like, that would be terrifying.
Gosh, she needs to lotion. She needs to hydrate that skin.
I know. I'm listening to you, and I was just thinking of that scene from Doctor Who with Cassandra, and she's just like, moisturize me, moisturize me. No, she's just a flap of skin, and she's supposed to be like the last human. And so that, they're constantly
God.
having to moisturize her, but that's what I was thinking. But, in my tribe, of course, we have deer women, we have little people, we have like a lot of different little things. But one of the things that I've been trying to rack my brain all day for it was the name that we have for these things. But we have these things that are very similar to changelings. And one of my friend Carol Lee, like a while back, she shared on Facebook that I think her kids were supposed to be asleep or they were supposed to be staying with somebody, and like so she was just by herself, and she just had one of her kids with her, and she thought he was sleeping, and so she went to go check on him, and when she went to check on him, you know it was one of these changeling things. Like she had left a window open and it had gotten in the house, and she was like, "Oh, like this isn't my kid. My kid's not here." But it looked sort of similar to her kid, like in the size and everything. And it took off out the window, and she locked, and she shared it on Facebook. And it jogged my memory because, like, back when I was in high school, my friend Tara was staying the night with me. And I shared my room with my little sister, who was probably about like 5 at the time. And she had one of those little Lion King beds, like a little toddler bed that was in the corner. And so my friend Tara was on the floor, I was on my bed, and we were just talking, and we thought she had been in there asleep the whole time. And so we were talking, and then all of a sudden, like, just jumps up out of bed and takes off out of the room. Like, just, it looks like my sister, and she takes off out of the room, and we're like, what the heck? And so, like, I go to check on her, and I'm like, okay, where did she go? Because we were living in like what the place called the Village in Red Rock, and like all the houses are kind of uniform, so there's not a lot of places she could go. And I didn't hear her opening any doors or anything. So I knocked on my mom's room, and my mom opened up, and I was like, hey, I was like, did Remy come in here? And she's like, "What do you mean? Did she come in here?" And I was like, "Well, she just jumped up out of bed and just took off." I said, I don't know where she went." And my mom's like, "She's been in here with us all evening." And we're like, "Ooh, what the like, okay, what the heck?" But it
Whoa.
was so crazy because my mom was like, "What do you mean? Somebody was in the house?" And I was like, "Yeah." I said, "We thought it was her sleeping in her bed." I said, "But then she just got up and she took off running." And sure enough, like the front door was open, like somebody had just taken off out the front door. And I was just like, "Okay, no, 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 no." But it creeped me out because so her brother, like, my parents would go into town quite often, and sometimes when I didn't want to be there by myself, I would just go across the street to her house. And I had gone over one time, and her brother was there, and he was just like, "Well, everyone's gone." I was like, "Well, that's cool." I was like, "Do you mind if I just stay here till my parents get back?" And he's like, "Yeah, that's fine." And I'm sitting there watching TV, and he's back in his room, and I just hear something in the kitchen, like something just going through like the cabinets, and I'm like, what the heck is this?" And I didn't want to go check because I'm also a scaredy cat. I'm that person who's watched enough horror films to know you don't go look. But so, like, I went and I knocked on his door, and I was like, "Hey," I was like, "I think something's in the kitchen." And he's like, "No." He was like, "Just get in here." And I was like, "Okay." So I went in his room, and he like had all these locks on his door. And I was like, "What the heck?" And but it turns out that they had a problem with little people. So they would get in the house and they would root around in their kitchen, and they would oftentimes like leave out little plates for them. So they would give them like potatoes, or they would leave them like vegetables just to try and keep them out of the house. But if they forgot, they would come in the house and start rooting around.
Straight
And
up
I
like
could
stray
hear
dogs or
them.
raccoons. That's
Yeah, and
crazy.
I thought it
Oh
was
my
so
god.
crazy because like we're sitting in his room and he's like they'll leave in just a little bit. Like it was just totally normal for him. And you can hear like just rooting around in the cabinets. We heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and I was just like, whoa, because I heard stories of little people before, but I never had an experience like that. And I think it was probably a couple years later too, I had a similar experience with little people where same friend Tara, she was watching her two sisters, I had my sister, and a bunch of girls, like we lived in a housing little development, so they would come down and we were all just hanging out in front of my house, and it got dark. So we told the girls, like, hey, you guys stay here. We're going to walk our friend Raven back up to her house and then we'll be right back. And as we start walking up, we called this place the village, but as we're walking up to our friend Raven's house, like we hear giggling and we hear people like somebody running behind the houses. And so we're thinking it's our sisters, like just following us like normal kids. And so we're like telling them like, shut up, go back home, get out of here, just trying to get him back. And we're like, we're going to tell mom on you, and just yelling at him. And we start walking, and like we can't see anything. Like we're waiting to catch him, but we don't see anything, but we can hear footsteps running behind us, and we're like what the heck? And we get up and we drop Raven off, get her to her house, and we're looking around like cuz we're like, okay, we got to see them running back somewhere. And like we don't see them. So we start walking back down, and as we start walking back down to our house, like we can hear him coming again, like behind us. And so we decide to split up and go around the house to try and catch him. We're like, okay, we're gonna scare them. And we split up and we start doing our little circling move to go around this house and to catch him, because we can hear like the giggling, we can hear the things. And so we go back around and we like start running and screaming, trying to scare them. And there's nobody back there, but behind there's like a field, and you could see the grass, like something running through the grass, like just that's where they ran, and you could still hear the laughing and giggling. And we were just like, oh
Oh
no,
wow.
no, 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 no. And like we went back to Tara's house, and our sisters were still there. They never left. And we just stayed there. And as soon as her dad got back, we were telling him what happened. And he's like, I told you girls, don't, don't be messing around back there. But we were just like, I don't know. Like I think that was the first time I realized that some of these stories, they aren't just stories.
Yeah. 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 I have one. It's not necessarily particular to uh any like native stories, but I remember listening to you guys' podcast. I don't remember when it was put out, but when you guys were talking about sleep paralysis, and like, so I didn't grow up like in any particular spiritual or religious expression. Like even my family doing stuff with our tribe and things like that. There wasn't like a particular, hey, here's how we pray all the time, or do ceremony this way, or do whatever, and so I just kind of just grew up, I guess I believe God to some degree, some kind of
Just
God.
grew
I
up
don't
like a
know.
heathen, huh?
Yes. Oh, well, definitely that. But and then so kind of whenever I was around 15, 16, I got involved with like a youth group that was local. It was kind of like a for a lot of problems I had at home. It was a great outlet for a lot of like first times expressing emotion, and I would spend like an hour just praying and kind of like so it was like a mix. I mean, I think creator can work through so many different avenues and show things, but so for the first time I was kind of tapped into thinking about the reality of other things besides just what I see, taste, touch, hear, and smell. And so, probably about a month after this, I think it was about a month, it was a pretty short time period. I remember I was laying in my room and I had like this little blue CD player. It was like clear and it emitted this blue light, and it's what I would play as I go to bed. And my bed was in the corner, and like so if I was laying on my back, my right shoulder would be right against the wall, and so I remember laying and falling asleep and someone touching my shoulder. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I'm sleepy. My mom or dad are coming in here, like they're waking me up, like, what's going on. And I was just kind of like, like leave me alone. And so something kept doing that. And then even before I opened my eyes, in my mind, I was like, wait, why would someone reach all the way across my body and touch this part of my shoulder rather than just touch this shoulder? Which is a weird thing to think, but that was what my mind thought. And like, I was just sitting there like, wait, what's that? And I look over, and so there's like a blue light in my room in general just because of the radio. And when I looked over, all I can describe it, if anyone's had any experiences like that, they kind of know what I mean. For me, it was like a black fog on the wall. It wasn't a shadow, because there wasn't really a shadow from there. And it was darker and more tangible. So almost like fog, but black and thicker. And it was on the wall. And I looked over and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's terrifying, whatever that is. And it moved across the wall, and then at the feet of my bed, like materialized, and just had that kind of like almost like a shape if someone had a black blanket on them. And it was just, I guess, looking at me. I didn't see eyes or anything, but it's just like standing there, and it's just dark black fog, and just there. And very similar thing. I can't move. I'm sitting there, my eyes are wide open. I'm looking everywhere. My eyes could move and everything, and I'm trying to yell to mom, dad, whoever. And it's not doing anything. It's just standing there. And I remember thinking, I'm panicking, of course. And it was weird because the first thought I had was like, oh, wait, what about prayer and God stuff? Like I was like, if it works anywhere, it's got to work here, right? And so I'm like laying there, and I start to just think of like, not any formal prayer. I wasn't a Pentecostal church, so it was just all kinds of random stuff. It wasn't Catholic or Lutheran or whatever, the youth group. And I really only went to the youth group mostly. And I remember thinking, just praying, and it was weird because what happened was, as I was thinking it, my mouth started to loosen a little, and I started to be able to say, and then it just went, and it felt like it just came off. Like, and if you've had that, you know how almost sudden it feels, like when it just kind of snaps out. And it's weird because like I jump up and I'm sitting there like, I'm like breathing hard, and I can't remember, but I might have even been sweating. I mean, it felt like so much energy was given off from me just trying to move. And I'm sitting there like, and it was weird because the feeling, and a lot of people have described it since, I'd never heard of this experience before, but like it was more than just me feeling scared. Of course there was scared, but I've been fearful even for my life other times, but I never felt, and a lot of people have described it the same way, like, oh, I felt like something was evil, like something was bad. Like I never felt bad like there. I felt scared. I felt terrified for myself, for others, things like that. But I was like, this just doesn't seem like a good thing, And the weird thing that happened as a result of some of this, in my mind, kind of collecting on the thought of it, was there was almost also a weird little confidence I had. I felt like the thing was trying to get into me or something, but that it couldn't. And so for me, it kind of had me a little bit more like, man, I feel protected to some degree. I feel solid. I haven't had that experience ever again. The weird thing is my best friend, he had that experience 2 weeks later. Neither one of us had ever talked about it. I didn't tell anybody because I was like, I know I started going to youth group a little bit, but I'm gonna sound crazy if I start talking about this to anybody. But then me and him talked like several months later, and we found out it happened within 2 weeks of each other. And it was just so weird because, I mean, when I got older, I wound up seeing some stuff about it. And unless I'm mistaken, I know that there's explanations, but it still seems like there's not some clear explanations for parts of it. Like why certain experiences, why certain expressions. It's just like, well, there could be the halluc because of the thing, or you feel fearful because you're scared. And I'm like, I do know what being terrified and fearful feels like. I know what all those things feels like. I wasn't even as scared quite yet, as much as I felt just like, oh gosh, this is bad, whatever it is. I'm not even scared yet because I don't comprehend what's going on, And it was just wild. It was the most, like, for me, the most tangible, weird thing I've ever experienced. And because I told that story before a long time ago, the only horror thing that my wife won't watch, and she'll watch the most awful torture movie, cut them all up, everything bad. She won't watch that nightmare thing that was on Netflix that talks about it. Like I don't know if y'all have ever seen it's called The Nightmare, and I don't know if it's a real documentary, but when you see the little simulations, you're like, oh, they had people who've definitely. I was like, yeah, that's what I saw. I was like, that was it. I was like, that's the thing almost. Some people saw eyes, or some people talk about it sitting on your chest. That didn't necessarily happen. I felt it touching me, and I saw it there, and I remember just being like, that is the most. I've had other things go on since at times, but that was the most intense I think that I've kind of had an experience like.
That's incredible. And yeah, absolutely horrifying. Yeah, I've read a
Yeah.
lot about sleep paralysis because I'm old pals with the sleep paralysis demon. And yeah, like scientifically, they can explain like when it happens and how it can be induced, through sleep deprivation or medication or whatever. But it's still, like you said, can't explain the similar hallucinations, the sleep paralysis demon, the shadow person, the Hat Man that everybody around the world has seen and hasn't talked to each other about, but somehow has the same exact experience with. Like, you can't explain it. So there's absolutely something supernatural, paranormal about it, and we will probably never know why, but it's going to keep happening, and it's absolutely horrifying. And it's something that, as a native person, um, I I got put a curse on last year. Somebody told me, like, yeah, hey, this person, she was an old coworker. She put a curse on me. Put a curse on you, Carrie. She's telling me about it. And she was like laughing about it. And this person participated in witchcraft and stuff like that. And I was like, oh crap. I don't take this stuff very lightly. And so I had my dad come over to the house, and he blessed the house. He smoked the house, cedared it, and prayed for it, and all that stuff. And I prayed, and I reached out to some elders, and I was like, "What would you suggest that I do?" And so I learned a lot about that experience, but ultimately came out thinking that we, our families, our people are blessed and protected by ancient medicine that we don't even understand, that we can't comprehend. And so there could be attacks on us from whatever paranormal ghost entity, demons, whatever. And it is protected by our ancestors, that they prayed for us and they put medicine on us. And I still believe that those ancestors are still looking after us, and that magic is still strong, even though we don't even know that it exists.
Yeah.
So
It's so true because yeah, because like so I had a funny experience here in LA when I first moved here. I went to 7-Eleven, and there was this hippie chick standing outside, and she was just being just like harassing everybody who walked by. And so like I kind of tried to swerve around her to kind of avoid it, but she started harassing me. She was like asking me for money, and I told her, I said, well, I said, when I come back out, if I have change, I'll give you the change. And she's like, no, I want $50. And I'm just like, $50? Like, I don't even have $50. I'm like, it's 7-Eleven. Like, hello. But, like, and she's like, starts harassing me. And she's like, well, if you don't give me $50, I'm going to curse you. And I'm like, okay. And so like I start walking off, and she starts saying like this weird like a gibberish language, but she's hopping
yeah,
around,
she's like
dancing around me and
Klaatu
stuff.
Varata Nick.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So
Quoting movies.
I let her do her thing, and I just looked at her, and I was just like, Halito Chimachakma. And I was like, your spirits have no power here. And she just froze and looked at me, and she just like walked off really fast. And I was laughing because the security guard at the 7-Eleven was like, what did you just say? I was just like, hello. I was at it like my native language, just saying hello and just a greeting. And he's cracking up. He's like, that's all you said? I was like, yeah. He goes, well, whatever it was, it made her think twice. And I was like, yeah. I said, but I said, to be honest, I feel that way. I said, because she's white, her spirits have no power on native lands. So, but it was just kind of like a funny interaction that I had here. And like, it still sticks with me because, oh man, if you saw the show that she had put on with kind of like speaking in her language or whatever language she was speaking and doing her little dance around me and everything,
Gibberish.
like,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
it was a little scary.
You're like, girl, do you even know what you're doing right now? Do you know who I am?
One of the most lasting images I have, and this is something I'm like, oh, I might even just use this when I make some little horror short or a book or something. So we live in a town that has like a little lake community, and so this little community, that's kind of where I'm at now. And so when I grew up, I came here a lot because I had friends who lived here, and we would just kind of be out here all the time, walking around the woods, walking around the lake, just being outside. Well, me and my friend walked down this road that usually turns and ends, but we just kept going, just bored, nothing else to do in Oklahoma. So we were just walking for a while, going through the woods, and we went and we saw a little trail, and so we turned down this trail, and I saw, still to this day, the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And when I walked into this trail, we turned in, and it was like you couldn't see down because it was twisting and turning, right? And so once we turned left on this trail, to get through that part of it, there was this area where there were probably like 80 black crows, like all on these, all set up, like facing me, like if you're gonna walk there, with little sticks stuck on their heads like horns, all just facing forward, like almost like a wall. There were so many of them. I mean, they were dead, I think, but like they were all just facing forward and looking there that way. And I don't know. I felt like it was super. I felt something super weird, but it could have been just fear. There's a lot of super country people, so sometimes they get isolated. In my mind, I was like, I don't want to be out here. Whether this is supernatural or just some crazy dude, this was like one of the weirdest things I'd ever saw. And I'm pretty sure we sprinted for like 3.5 miles after that, because it was just, I mean, if you can imagine seeing that many birds, just, I mean, like whatever process it was for them to get little sticks and stick them in a crow's head as it's facing you and then set them all up for you to be there. I had like chills, and I think I even had a nightmare about it later on, and which I have nightmares a lot, but like it was just super creepy. And one of the most like lasting images, when you mentioned the word lasting image, that was the first thought I had out here, was just seeing that thing. And even to this day, it's kind of down the road from me. I was like, oh, I don't go very far past this road at all. I was like, whatever's going on over there does not need my help.
Wow, that is horrifying. How morbid. Holy cow.
Yeah.
That's
For
crazy.
yeah. Yeah. I had always like my dad was very distrusting of adults in a lot of ways, but not in a way where I could never do anything, but in a way where he kind of instilled it into me, to where when I was a kid, I didn't even like a lot of kid stuff. I was like, why is this adult man talking like a kid? That's weird. I was like, let me go back and watch Freddy Krueger or something. That's more normal for my age. I don't.
Wow. Incredible. Well, cool. Any last stories, any last thoughts from you guys before we wrap it up for the night?
Well, I have one for you. I don't know if you said you were Kiowa, so I don't know if you might be familiar with the area around Mountain View, Godibo. But when I was younger, I
I
used to live,
sort of, yeah.
yeah, I used to live a little outside of Godibo, back kind of like more towards Rainy Mountain, actually. But we used to live in this big house that was, I don't know if it was supposed to be like like a governor's mansion or something like that at one time, but it was just like a big old house. But we had moved in there and it was pretty run down at the time. And but it was like I remember running through, like, everything was just felt so oversized, like a little extravagant, but it was super run down. But like I remember the kitchen, like the counters were high enough to where we used to chase each other through them. But we used to have all these like weird experiences out there. Like people would see cars driving in the driveway, they would see the lights, but then there'd be no cars outside. They'd hear my grandma would stay home most of the time because she was in a wheelchair, and it was just easier for her to stay home than to go out. And so when she'd be there by herself, or if she was there with one of my aunts, like they would hear people talking or like moving around upstairs, even though they knew nobody else was there. Place was creepy, and we have like a lot of stories, but one that stuck out is like for a few years I was having like this recurring dream of being in like kind of like a little area where we had our toys that they would put us to play, and across the way was my mom's room and my room, and my mom would be doing laundry and she'd iron and we'd be playing in the little room. And but I would have this recurring dream of me and my cousin, and we had to have been about like maybe 4 and 3 at the time. And we'd always be playing, and there would be this clown doll, like, you know, those old school clown dolls where you had the string, you pull it, and it would say like little phrases, it would laugh, kind of thing, you know. But I remember us playing in there, and this doll sitting up and just talking to us. And it's at first it was the things that it would say if you pulled the string, and we just kind of ignored it because we were playing with our other toys. But then pretty soon it started saying things that it wasn't programmed to say, and things that were scaring us. Like I don't exactly know like what it was saying, but it would scare us. And we kept like trying to get it to stop, and we ended up putting it into like these little laundry rooms that these old houses had. They were like little bitty tiny closets. They had like these little locks, and you just open it and a little space in there so you could put your laundry in. But I remember us putting that clown in there and shutting the door, and we could hear it kind of still laughing at us and everything. And I would have this recurring dream. And of course, I've always been terrified of clowns. And I always chalked it up to it because I think we all watched it way too early in our lives. Um, but I always chalked it up to it. But like, it would be such a terrifying dream that I would literally wake up and I would be like covered in sweat. I'd be like, my heart would be beating fast, and I would like made no sense to me. And I had moved back to Oklahoma back 2008, I believe it was. And I was talking to my aunt about this, and I was telling her about the dream. And I was like, yeah, I said, it's crazy. I said, it happens, you know, quite a bit. I said, but it's always the same dream. Like nothing ever changes. There's like no deviation or anything. It's always just the same. And I wake up the same way. And my cousin was there, and he's like, that's weird. He goes, like, I have a very similar dream. And I was like, Yeah." And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "The same thing." He goes, "We're playing in the room, and it starts saying things it's not supposed to say, and we put it in this little closet." And he goes, "And then, you know, like I wake up." And I'm like, "Oh." I was like, "That's really creepy that we're having the same dream." And he's also terrified of clowns. But here's the kicker. It wasn't until like I think maybe like 3 years ago now, I believe it was 2021, that I just happened to find the picture, and I wish I could show it a little better, but that little clown back there is the clown that I was dreaming of. I
No
actually
way.
had
Why
that
did you
doll.
show us? I didn't want to see
God,
that.
no,
And at
send it to
that
me. I'm gonna
age,
put it right in this episode.
yeah, like it
That is
tripped me
haunting.
out because I
Man.
was like, holy crap. I was like, it's there in that picture. Like, I
Well, let me
actually
get this
had that
ready.
doll. And like at the same age that I was having these dreams, and like I was showing my cousin, and he just like freaked out. Like he was just like, oh my God, it's real. I can't believe that thing was real. And like we had so many stories, like haunted doll stories that happened in that house that, you know, now I'm thinking back like, oh, that wasn't a dream. That had to have been like some memory of something that me and my cousin experienced when we were little that was just bubbling to the surface. But we had so many stories in that house. You know, another story that happened that involved a doll. My uncle had married a Hopi woman, and her parents weren't really didn't really approve of the marriage or anything, you know. But they had given her a doll, and I guess it had like somebody gave her a medicine pouch. We're not sure who, but we think they gave her some bad medicine, and because like we were super Christian at the time, like my grandpa was a minister, her husband was a minister, everybody was ministers at the time. Um, but she hid it in the doll because she didn't want to tell anyone that she had it. And she had like just like this little rag doll thing. And her grandma had passed away. So they went to Colorado for the grandma's funeral, and it was her, my aunt, and my uncle. And when they got to the funeral, my aunt said, you know, everything was good. She goes, you know, we went through the funeral, and she goes, I went to bed that night, and she goes, she goes, it was probably about like 2 or 3 in the morning. She goes, I woke up and there was this woman standing in my doorway, and she was telling me, I just wanted to say thank you for taking care of my granddaughter. And she goes, but you need to go home right now. And my aunt was like, what? She goes, you need to get your brother, and you need to go home right now. And so my aunt said, like, it just filled her with like a sense of dread that she went, and she was telling my uncle like what had happened. And, you know, they were like, what old lady? And she described her, and she was describing my uncle's wife's grandma that just passed away. And they were like, okay, so I guess we're going home. So they got in the car and they started heading back to Oklahoma. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma, we would have church meetings in the house. So there would be a lot of little other preachers that would come in and they would do like Bible study and stuff. And, we'd have a meal afterwards. And so they were having one of those things and they were getting ready to eat the meal. Everybody was getting their plates. And my other uncle, David, and his wife were there visiting for the weekend. And so they got their plates and they didn't want to eat with the rest of the crowd. So they went up to my uncle's room to hang out. And while they were in there, they said like they had like this really uneasy feeling like somebody was watching them and they were just kind of playing it off. And they just started eating and they started talking. And then pretty soon they heard laughing and they were looking around like, okay, where is this laughing coming from? And they couldn't see anything laughing. So they just went back and kind of ignored it. And then pretty soon they saw my uncle's wife saw movement out of the corner of her eye. And when she looked up on the shelf, that doll was shaking and it was laughing. And they got freaked out. And my uncle started choking and he couldn't breathe. So my aunt ran down and she's like, I don't know what's going on. She's like, he's choking, he can't breathe. And so they all run upstairs and he's choking and he's pointing up at the doll. And the doll is up there just laughing. And so they get the doll. And while all this is going on, my aunt and uncle coming from Colorado were pulling in about the time this is all starting to happen. And so they get in the house, and my grandpa and a couple of other preachers are up there, and they got this doll in a bag. And they come down and they see my aunt, and they're telling her and my mom, and I'm not sure who the other lady was, but they were like, you guys got to get the kids and take them away from the house. They were like, just get them in the car, take them, and we'll let you know when it's okay to bring them back. And so, like, I remember being shuttled into a car with my cousins and some other kids, and they drove us out to the road. And we're all sitting there just watching the house. And, after a while, like, I remember just seeing all the lights come on in the house, just one after another, just like going off, on, off, on. And I was like, what the heck? And I was little, so I didn't really hear like what had actually happened till I was older. And my aunt was telling us scary stories one night. But apparently they took the doll and they took it outside and put it in a trash can and they burned it and they were praying over it. And like they said, like once that doll started to burn, they said all the lights in the house just started going off and on, almost like whatever spirit was in that doll was trying to find somewhere else to go. And like we had all these experiences with this doll, and then the clown doll, and then even my sister, just a couple years ago, I was doing Twitter Spaces where I would share scary stories and talk with different creatives and everything. And I was doing an interview with Mike J. Marin, who did the smudging. And just a couple of nights before, my sister called me and she's like, hey, she's like, I'm just giving you a heads up. She goes, we had some weird stuff happening here. And she goes, I don't know what it is. She goes, but I think it's going to bother you next. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, what happened? And so my mom passed away in 2021. And, traditionally, we're supposed to burn everything and get rid of everything. But because of the way my mom passed away, like it was a little traumatic and for us. So my sister had kept some of my mom's stuff. She kept an overnight bag that she would take to the hospital when my mom needed to go. And she kept this teddy bear that my mom had that she called Timothy. And she kept it for my nieces. And my sister said, yeah, she goes, some things have been going on for a while. She goes, but I was just kind of ignoring them, hoping they would go away. She goes, but my girls are scared. She goes, like, they didn't want to go to their room. They were always like saying something was in the closet. And she goes, but today, she goes, Lexi was doing her classes in the living room. She goes, I had the other two in the bathtub. And she goes, checked on Lexi. I made sure she was all set up for her classes. She goes, then I walked to the bathroom. And she goes, when I walked to the bathroom, she goes, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a little girl sitting on the bed. And she's thinking, she's like, when did Lexi get that dress? And she goes, and then I was like, wait a second, Lexi's not wearing a dress. So she goes, and I turned and looked, and she goes, and there's this little girl sitting there, and she's dressed in like these old tiny clothes. And my sister said, I started to walk towards the bedroom to see, okay, who's this kid in my girl's room? And she disappeared. And my sister said, like, she goes, and I was kind of freaked out and I didn't want to say anything to the girls. She goes, so I just, went about the day. And she goes, and towards the evening, she goes, I put the girls down for bed, and she goes, all of a sudden they're crying and they don't want to go back to their room. And she goes, and I'm just like, okay, she's like, something's wrong. And she goes, and I didn't want to say anything to my partner about the little girl because I didn't want him to think I was just, playing tricks or crazy or anything. And, she goes, they got the girls in the living room and lay down and everything. She goes, and I was talking to her partner, and she goes, like, she was telling him what she's seen. She goes, I think that something's going on. And she goes, I expected him to say I was crazy, but he said, yeah, I saw something very similar the other night. And he goes, I just didn't want to believe it. I saw it. He goes, he was up playing video games in the living room. And he said he turned around and there was just a little girl sitting on their couch. And he's like, it wasn't our girls. He goes, and he's like, I just didn't want to believe that I was seeing what I was seeing. He goes, because it was just gone. He goes, as soon as I saw it, it was gone. And so she called her preacher at the church that she went to, and she told him, like, I know it's late. She goes, but the girls are scared. She goes, there's something going on here, and, we just want it to get taken care of. And so her preacher went over to her house, and, they prayed over the apartment. They were walking through, and he was asking her, is there anything here that something might be attached to? And my sister was like, well, we kept some of my mom's stuff. And he's kind of looked at her like, okay, come on. We know this is the issue. So she's like, my sister said, I gave him the bag and I gave him Timothy, and he took him out. And he said that he was going to call her when they finished getting rid of him. And she goes, it was about an hour or two later that he called her, and he said that when they went to go burn the bag burned fine with my mom's clothes and stuff in it. It burned fine, but the doll wouldn't burn. Whenever they would try to put it in the fire would go out. And they were like, what? And they thought maybe because it's a kid's toy, it had like some kind of fire retardant on it or something. And they said they kept trying to light it on fire and it wouldn't burn. And then finally he's like, he goes, we were praying. He goes, and, I called my wife and I called my son out, and I was like, I think I need some help over here. And so they all went out and they were all praying. And, he goes, we did some of our traditional medicine as well. And he goes, and they finally got the doll to burn. He goes, but it took him a long time to get that teddy bear to burn. And my sister said, like, she was telling him, and she goes, and I just got this sense of dread, like, okay, it can't mess with us now. It's going after my sister. And sure enough, like, while she's talking to me, I'm like in my middle room because we live in a studio apartment with my partner, and he's still in bed. And I go in the middle room so I could talk to her without waking him up. And I come out of the room and I'm still on the phone with her. And all I see is my partner jumping up and running to the door. And I'm like, what the heck? And he's like, your sister called, and he goes, I just had this feeling like something was going to happen. And he goes, and sure enough, he goes, like, he goes, I don't know what it was. He goes, but he's like, I was just watching the door. And he goes, I saw the door handle turn. And he goes, and I just got up and just jumped to the door. And sure enough, like, he's like, and when I got to the door, he goes, it was open, and he like closed it. And we always have our door deadlocked and locked because we live in LA. And so I was like, okay, this is getting crazy here. And I was telling him what my sister said, and he's like, yeah, so he's like, something's weird. But where our door was the weirdest thing because it almost felt like electricity. Like when you're touching those balls and those science machines and your hair starts raising up and everything, like static electricity. That's what it felt like. And so I called my aunt and I told her what was going on. And I was like, can you pray with us for a little bit? And she's like, yeah. And so she's like, walk me through the apartment and I'll pray. She's like, do you got sage or cedar? And I'm like, yeah. I said, we got some Palo Santo. And she's like, all right, that'll do. And so we're trying to go through the apartment and smoke everything off while she's praying. And whatever energy was in here was moving, like as we were smoking the place off. And the one place that we couldn't get the Palo Santo to burn was our bathroom. Like it would not stay lit. Like there was no smoke. Like it would just stop. And we were like, what the heck? And but my aunt prayed. We went to bed, and the next night, I was doing the interview, and we had a studio space in the back of our apartment, and So I was back there and I was doing this interview, and all of a sudden, halfway through the interview, the door opened. And I was like, oh no. And I thought maybe another tenant had tried to come in, just kind of curious about what's going on back there. And so, like, I went to close the door and nobody's out there. And I was just like, okay, that was weird, but I kind of thought maybe I just didn't shut it right. So we go on with the interview, and I'm sitting there and I feel like something breathe, like right behind me, like they're just somebody put their head right by mine and was breathing. And I turned, and when I turned, I heard hello. And I was like, what the, like, what? And I was like, okay, guys. And like, I was still on the air and I was freaking out, and got up and I was like, okay, who said that? And I was looking outside and trying to see if somebody was just trying to scare me, and there's nobody there. And so, like, and I'm trying to continue the interview and go on, and I'm just walking around and, just still kind of looking. And my guest is telling a story and everything, so I don't really have to talk, but I go to look out the bathroom window to see if somebody might be sitting out there smoking or something. And I'm standing there and I felt my hair just kind of like somebody just like whew. And I turned around so fast expecting someone to be there, and there is no one there. And it scared the crap out of me. Like, I had goosebumps on my arms, and like, my guest had finished his story, thankfully, and I was just like, okay, guys, I gotta go. I gotta go. And I shut it down and I called my partner. I was like, can you come get me? I don't want to walk out of here by myself. And he's like, why? I said something back here. And he's like, okay, I'll be right there. And so, like, I start trying to shut everything down to leave, and like I can feel like somebody's like just standing behind me. And so, like, I get myself and I'm like, okay, I can't wait for him. And I just run out of our little studio space. I didn't even bother locking it up or anything. I just ran out, and he was halfway down the driveway. And he was like, I was coming to get you. I was like, I don't care. I was like, I couldn't stay there. And he's like, what happened? I said, I think whatever was here last night is back in the studio. And we didn't go back there for 2 days, until like I felt less freaked out just to go back. And we had, my aunt, we had her pray over it, and we were smoking it off and everything. And it was just the weirdest thing because, like, we got to talking about it, like, with my aunt, my sister, and we kind of think that maybe whatever spirit was in that doll, like way back when, has kind of followed the family. And because we have several haunted doll stories in our family. And so we kind of think maybe that whatever that spirit was has just kind of followed and has stuck with us and manifested itself just at different times. But it's like one of the weirdest things I've ever
Yeah.
experienced.
Incredible. Horrifying. I am going to have nightmares. Thank you guys. Johnny, oof, save some for next time. Well, awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming on. I know that we could probably talk for hours, but like I said, let's save some for next time. I'll have you guys back on the show. Hopefully, we can get Oren on the next time, and yeah, we can have a good time. Well, again, thank you guys for coming on. We're going to go ahead and end it here. You guys can find Kevin on Instagram and soon to be podcast, The Nativeverse. And I'm excited to hopefully be on the show at some point and talk about horror and comics and everything else. And Johnny, where can everybody find you?
Oh, well, you can find me on X. I'm on Instagram, and anywhere you just type in Johnny J, you'll be sure to find me, because I'm pretty sure I am the Matrix, because I am that online.
Yeah. I love it. Well, sweet. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you like the show, please rate and review us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, or your podcast app of choice. You can find us on Instagram at The Skullcrawlers, Twitter at _Skullcrawlers, and on YouTube, Skullcrawlers Movie Club. It's easy to find. And as always, sleep with one eye open because you never know who's watching. And thanks for wearing your brown pants.